So our opening question will be, when did you receive a bad report in school? Of course, some of you, I know you never got that happen, but I have, and I'll share about that here shortly. But before we do that, let's just recite the first 8 books, the names of the first 8 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. Good job, everybody. Thank you. And that's something that we do periodically in our classes, is we're trying to make sure that not only do we know the books of the Bible, but certainly hopefully our children and our grandchildren do. I think one of my grandchildren had a song for all the New Testament books. He had that memorized, I think, at age 3. But he's a lot sharper than I was at age 3. He's a pretty bright young man. So anyway, but that's important, because when we say, well, let's turn our Bibles to Genesis chapter 37, like we're going to tonight, everybody knows, oh, that's the first book of the Bible. That's easy. I can find that. And so that's why it's important for us to know those kinds of things. So when did you receive a bad report at school? Well, I was normally a pretty good kid, even though I wasn't born in a Christian family or raised in a Christian family. But, there's some things that are just beyond my ability to withstand temptation. And we had some snow where I grew up in Three Forks, and I was in elementary school. And I went home for lunch because I only lived about 5 blocks away from the school. And so this one classmate of mine, his mom would pick him up for lunch and take him home because he lived farther away. Well, we had the bright idea, because it was really slick and icy and everything. Well, let's just grab a hold of that bumper and we can just hooky bob, that's what it's called, right? All the way home, and we'll just, ski off we'll just let go when we got home. Well, little to my knowledge, she knew exactly who my friend and I were, that were doing that, and called the principal during lunch. So when we got back to school, and we got called into the principal's office, and we received some consequences. That's those circumstances that are touched by a metal object. At times, back in those days, they could do that in the principal's office. So that was one of my bad reports. That lady gave me a bad report, and I paid some consequences for that. Anybody else ever receive a bad report from school and wants to share it? Certainly. Ross?
I was in Bozeman at MSU going through ROTC to get my commission in the Air Force. I was also working on my master's degree. And it was in political science, and my, what do they call the person that guides you through your program?
Your advisor?
Advisor happened to be a lady that, due to my keen senses of observation over 2 years, she didn't seem to like men much. She did really not like the military. She didn't like conservatives. She didn't like Christians.
You were all of the above.
And here I was showing up once a week in my military uniform, right? So she advised me through 2 years of my program, and it was set up for me to finish my master's degree in those 2 years. And she had said all along that the classes that I had to take for ROTC would count as electives. Well, we got to the end. I had to put in my paperwork to graduate, and she said, we can't count these classes. So I was high and dry, and nothing I could do about it. So that was a kind of a discouraging report in school.
Wow.
That's too bad. Anybody else receive a bad report at school and would like to share that with us tonight? If not, we'll move right into Genesis 37. If we can get a reader for the first 11 verses. And as we read through there, We'll ask the question, what contributed to this family's recipe for disaster? This family really has a recipe for disaster. So what I call that is a good example of a bad example. You know, and we all have those around us if we're paying attention. We see people who maybe aren't doing the way things right, and we say, oh boy, that's a good example of a bad example. Note to Scott, don't do that. So let's go ahead and read that, and you can ask for some suggestions, discussion on that in this dysfunctional family. Everybody got that for us, Bob? Thank you.
Now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. This is the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. Also, he made him a tunic of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. So he said to them, please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheep arose and also stood upright. And indeed your sheaves stood all around and bowed down to my sheep. And his brothers said to him, shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed still another dream and told it to his brothers, and said, look, I have dreamed another dream. And this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me. So he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you? And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind.
Okay, so what in this narrative, and in Genesis basically is full of narratives. This is kind of really beginning what's called the 10th narrative of the book of Genesis, and where you can kind of pick those up where it says verse 2, this is the account. If you look for that word, that this is the account, then you're kind of moving into the next narrative a little bit. So in this narrative, what did you notice about things that maybe contributed to this family's recipe for disaster? Anybody notice anything in there?
Not a thing, nope.
Not a thing? Oh my goodness, Ross.
The cruelty of older siblings.
I resemble that. Now, did the younger sibling have any responsibility in that situation? Anything there? No?
He was a brat. But I think we can't talk about this without putting some of the blame on Jacob.
Yeah.
I don't think he helped much. Yeah, it's just got dysfunctional written all over it.
Yeah. So Jacob's, I call it passivity. You go back to Adam, and he's standing there when the serpent's talking to Eve, and why doesn't he just take a rock and kill that serpent? You know, I mean, passivity, that was a problem for Jacob. The younger sibling was a tattletale. We see that. He brings a bad report about his brothers. You know, that wouldn't sit real well with you. You know, you got your little brother or sister coming to dad and saying, hey, you know, my older brothers aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. And that wouldn't be real good. What else? Go ahead, Dan.
Favoritism.
Favoritism written all over, generational favoritism, right? So, you know, and again, it's kind of like we talked about earlier. When I looked at my family of origin, after I became a Christian, I thought, well, some things they did okay with. But, now as a Christian, I'm starting to evaluate everything from a very different lens, and I'm thinking, I don't want to make that mistake with my children. I want to change that, and do I still make mistakes? Absolutely. But I try not to, and try to learn from those mistakes that maybe I lived through to make a better life for everybody around me. Good. What else? Betty?
Well, those things were coming from God.
Okay. So God's definitely
He was making up.
God's definitely involved in here, and that's our main point, is that God is still at work in the middle of family problems. And yet we can't say God made them do these things. They knew better, but He used it and He worked in spite of it, and He continued to work in the middle of all those things. So I think, in some ways, we have to realize that God can work in spite of a real messy situation like we have here. Anything else?
Joseph received that information from God.
Right.
That's what I was
Oh,
saying.
okay.
Yes.
So, did he have to share that with his brothers?
No.
That's kind of the question. How my brother? Think about it. How are my brothers going to react to this when I say, you guys are all going to bow down to me? It may be true. You don't have to share everything, right? You can be, I guess, self-controlled enough to say, is this going to be helpful for building others up? Or is this going to be helpful for them killing me? There are certain situations you don't have to share even that information that God has given to you. Some people can't handle it. Martha?
Well, it said in verse, I think 4, that the brothers couldn't even say a kind word. I mean, they just had hatred. So
Yeah.
that's a hostile environment when
Yeah.
there's that much friction going on in the home.
Hatred is definitely a huge problem, and that's again where hopefully the parent or parents would step in and say, we're part of the Lucasen family and we don't live like this. That's important. Go ahead, Doris.
Also, Jacob fueled the fire because he sent him out. He knew that they didn't like him. I mean, you know that there was hatred and stuff, and he fueled the fire and sent them out and said, hey, go tell on your brothers.
Yeah.
He set them up.
Yeah. He seems to kind of be oblivious to this animosity going on in the family, and that's probably why he would do that. No one would think, I'm going to send my son out, and there's a good possibility he's going to get killed, by his brothers, or, worse, sold into slavery or whatever, I mean, I don't think he had that even on his radar, that was even a possibility. And I think they're kind of trying to exact some revenge maybe from him because of his arrogance, or they would perceive arrogance or pride or cockiness. And they're jealous, it says. And those are two things that people just don't do very well. That's why God said, let me take care. Let me take care of revenge. Let me take care of jealousy. I'm a jealous God. I'll take care of that. Because we just don't handle that very well. And it's just evidenced in this particular situation. So looking at the time, what are some other things that maybe not in here that can also contribute to a family's recipe for disaster? What are some other things that you could say? Maybe we've kind of talked about lack of discipline already here in this case a little bit. What else, Bill?
Well, selfishness.
Selfishness?
I mean, in our house, there's 8 different personalities. And it doesn't take very much for one person just to seek, looking out for number one. And that just has ripple effects. So, say, selfishness.
Selfishness, exactly. That could be parental or children or whatever, Ross.
In the last 12 months, I've learned of 2 of my high school classmates dying. And I was thinking about them, praying for their families, because one was recently, and it dawned on me that both families, both my friends that I grew up with that have passed on, in the last year, both sets of parents were alcoholics.
Mhm.
And it led to disastrous things in their lives. Just poor choices on their part for the way they lived and their health. It's kind of interesting to think about that.
So we could lump that into a bigger category called addiction.
Yeah.
Addiction to whatever, you know, it could be a lot of different things, but alcohol in this case that you're bringing up. Good. Good. Anybody else? Any other things? Michelle?
There's the habit of being all about appearances, like the family revolves around what does everything appear like? Does everything appear okay? Do we seem perfect? And that can be really damaging to children, even trying to keep up appearances and the dishonesty that comes with that they're living in.
Good. So appearances, dishonesty, you know, seeking the approval of men over the approval of God, those kinds of things. Good. Good. Marcy?
Abuse?
Abuse,
Verbal
definitely.
abuse, physical abuse.
Yeah, emotional abuse, verbal abuse, physical abuse. Very good. We've already talked about passivity, so we'll go ahead and just think about the opposite now. How can we be examples of God's grace to our families? What are some characteristics of God's grace that we could demonstrate in our families, and other than just saying all the opposite of what we just talked about? And that's very true. Tammy?
I think unconditional love and acceptance.
Good. Good. Unconditional love and acceptance. Tammy, great point. Ross?
An example of seeking first God's kingdom.
Okay. As I'm known to say, more will be caught than taught. And so the parents especially setting that example of seeking the kingdom and seeking God and His righteousness first. Not only on Sunday morning, but as a lifestyle. And that's really, you know, why we've really shifted the curriculum to be more discipleship driven, because that's so important for all of us to live this out Monday through Sunday, not just on Sunday morning. And so that's good. I just think of forgiveness. If those brothers could have forgiven that young whippersnapper for his lofty dreams, you know, that would have solved everything, right? Or at least a lot of it. Just say, oh, he's just a dreamer, you know, he's just a young whippersnapper dreamer. You know, don't let, oh, he's crazy, you know, just dismiss him totally. Let's just forgive him. He doesn't know any better. He's too young. So, what else? Someone else? Bam?
Admission when you're wrong.
Good.
Not only probably in families, but also when you're placed in a position of leadership, either as a boss or a friend or whomever.
Good. Just being humble enough and admit when you're wrong. So that's a very good example again. I remember, and I've shared this before, times where I had to go to my sons, and because I was not parenting in a godly way, and I had to confess my sin to them and ask them to forgive me. And I thought, you know, really, after I thought about that, how else are they going to learn how to confess their sins? If they don't see it in me, how are they going to learn how to do that? You know, it's not like they're going to learn at the public school, for sure. You know, they're not going to learn that. Let's see, Martha, did you have something?
I was just along the same lines as Miss Pam this morning. I apologized to my little girls because they said something, and I mimicked them because it was really cute. And then they took offense to it, so I apologized, and I made it really, you know, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize it was, well, Kate looked up to me and she said, "Can you apologize again?"
Mom, you need some practice. Can you do that again?
I mean, they really absorbed it. It meant so much to them. I didn't think it would be that much. She said, "Can you do that
Look, this is hard enough on me the first time. I don't know if I can do it a second time. I love it. Those are good kids. Good kids. Good discussion. Thank you. I wrote down build each other up, you know, instead of tearing each other down. Treat others as you want to be treated. So a lot of good things. We could go on for probably the rest of our time together, which we won't. Let's go over to verses 12 through 36. If I could, that's a pretty long reading. So if someone wants to read 12 through 23, and someone else read 24 through 36, go ahead with 12 through 23, Steph. And 24 through 36. Anybody? Bill? And then could someone else get Galatians 6 and verse 7 and 8? Galatians 6, 7, and 8. Anybody? Thanks, Martha. And as we read through this, we're going to see some consequences here, I believe. And how do we see different family members reap what they have sown? Obviously, you know, God is still working through this whole thing, but there's still going to be some consequences. Going to be some consequences. So we'll go ahead with, I think with it, Steph, you're going to start with verse 12.
Okay, Genesis 37, starting at verse 12. One day Joseph's brothers went to Shechem to herd their father's sheep. Jacob said to Joseph, "Go to Shechem. Your brothers are there herding the sheep." Joseph answered, "I will go." His father said, "Go and see if your brothers and sheep are all right. Then come back and tell me." So Joseph's father sent him from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph came to Shechem, a man found him wandering in the field. He asked Joseph, "What are you looking for?" Joseph answered, "I am looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are herding the sheep?" The man said, "They are already gone. I heard them say they were going back to Dothan." So Joseph went to look for his brothers and found them in Dothan. Joseph's brothers saw him coming from far away. Before he reached them, they made a plan to kill him. They said to each other, "Here comes that dreamer. Let's kill him and throw his body into one of the wells. We can tell our father that a wild animal killed him. Then we will see what will become of his dreams." But Reuben heard their plan and saved Joseph. He said, "Let's not kill him. Don't spill any blood. Throw him into this well here in the desert, but don't hurt him." Reuben planned to save Joseph later and send him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they pulled off his robe with long sleeves. Was that it, Scott?
Sure.
23.
Verse 24.
And they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother in our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes. He returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and I, where shall I go?" Then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, "This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not." And he identified it and said, "It is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured it." Joseph was without doubt torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son for many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son in the morning." Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard.
Thank you. Galatians?
Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. The one who sows to please his sinful nature from the nature will reap destruction, and the one who sows to please the Spirit from the Spirit will reap eternal life.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for reading, and do you see some of these consequences that are being reaped here? Yeah, it's kind of ironic, some of these things. I mean, Jacob was, a trickster, and now he's being tricked. You know, what goes around comes around. That's kind of a saying that many of us are familiar with. So that's one consequence, or one reaping that we could see. We kind of talked about this a little bit earlier. Jacob was really out of touch with the animosity in between his sons, so he really kind of sent the son he loved the most, his favorite, into an extremely dangerous situation. You know, and so he ends up losing Joseph, at least for a couple of decades, it appears. And so that was his reaping what he had sown, just by not having an awareness about how is my family dynamic. You know, families are systems, and you change one thing in the family, that it changes the whole system. So he just didn't have that kind of a concept. What else could you see in these verses? What did the brothers' hatred lead them to think about doing? Does that sound familiar from the scriptures? Yeah. Now they didn't end up doing that, but, what did that produce for them for a couple decades? How do you think they felt every time they saw their dad? Yeah, a lot of guilt, Bob.
Scott Peck wrote a book called The People That Lie, and one of the things he talks about in there is group mentality. And the primary example that really affected Scott Peck when he was a young psychiatrist for the federal government was what happened in Vietnam with the massacre, My Lai Village, or what it was called. And what was so disturbing about that is that there were a lot of kind of non-participants that were there, and they saw what happened, but none of them said. It was about a year before anybody said anything. And so they held on to this terrible, terrible story, even those who didn't even go along with it, but they did go along with it. I mean, and that kind of set Scott Peck on a road of, he wrote The Road Less Traveled and several other really, really good books, and that event, I think, changed his whole life and his whole future. The books that he wrote that he was very successful with. There's a mentality there that is just extremely unhealthy.
All it would have taken is one person to say, wait a minute, guys, this is a bad idea. This is our brother. We don't like him, but we don't need to get rid of him. I mean, all it would have taken...
Reuben came close, but...
He came close, and, that's kind of another story. We kind of have to read back in Genesis, but Reuben did something that really kind of lost his credibility, right? He was responsible, but he committed incest with Bilhah. So you think his brothers are going to listen to him? He's just righteous. No, not really. Kind of guy. Bill?
I always think two things about this story. One, it gives me a lot of hope. See, this is an insanely dysfunctional family. Like, they're debating, do we sell our brother or kill him?
Yeah.
But it sort of has a happy ending. You got to wait a while to get there.
Yeah.
So God can redeem it.
Amen.
So that's the first thing that I always get hope when I read this really messed up story. But also, I think for all these guys, kind of what Bob was saying, like, this is forever going to be a part of their story. Even though God's going to redeem it much later down the road, they're always going to know that. It's part of their story. And like, they had to live with it for a couple decades. So the term today is moral injury, where you see something so heinous, or you prevent something, you don't stop it when you could, or you do it yourself. But the result is, you can't see any goodness in the world anymore. It's really hard to come back from. And they've had to struggle with this for like 20 years, knowing what they did. And like you said, their dad was a reminder of it. And at some point, their fury is going to wear off against the brother, but they're still carrying the story the rest of their life.
Yeah. Even if someone would have said, you know, let's let him go home. Let's sleep on it. We can always track him down tomorrow. They'd probably say, oh, that was a terrible idea. Let's just let that go. A lot of good things shared tonight. Thank you. I think about even Jacob by refusing comfort from his family. He was stuck in grief for decades. You know, and Jewish tradition was you had kind of 30 days for mourning that you wore the clothing and things that you're supposed to, that you were in mourning, and then you're supposed to start moving forward. You know, after a period of time. It might have been different for different levels of relationship, but, you know, that was definitely not a healthy decision on his part. So, anyway, we do see, as Bill says, it has a great ending, and we don't get to read the whole ending tonight. But let's go ahead and skip chapter 38. It's pretty bad. But we'll go to 39, and I'll read verses 1 through 6. And how do we see, as we think about this story, how we see God as working? And as we've already said, God is still at work in the middle of a family problem, huge family problems. God's still working even when life is a mess. You know, and now we see kind of how this plan is looking a little bit better anyway, verses 1 through 6 of chapter 39. Now, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian, who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. So the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in house and in field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. And we'll stop there in verse 6. So how do we see God working his plan in this situation? Who knew anything about what the future would bring, right? And we won't get to that tonight, but the Lord was with Joseph. He made him very successful. He made him prosperous. And, you know, the thing as we read about Joseph is that the Lord is with him in good situations and bad. Do we ever think sometimes that, you know, man, the Lord was with me when things are going great, but now that things aren't going so well, I'm not sure he's still with me. You ever feel that maybe we're not as blessed when we're going through difficult times, or maybe be even more blessed because he's probably got our attention a lot more than he had when things are great. Bob, were you going to say something? Okay. Any other ways we see God working his plan? He kept getting greater responsibility to do his success. God blessed everything in his household, in his field. God's fulfilling his promise that he made to Abraham's offspring to bless the nations, wasn't he? He's blessing Egypt now, as well as blessing the future Israelites. And of course, he was also helping those Israelites in the long term to grow in number as well. But the thing I really like from D6, it was a week or two or three ago, that God is bigger than our mistakes and our circumstances. You know, I've written that down numerous times. God is bigger than my mistakes and bigger than my circumstances. And we have a big God. We have a really big God. And he can handle what we're going through. Just to kind of close out quickly tonight, some similarities between Joseph and Jesus. Have you thought about that before? Some similarities between Joseph and Jesus. You know, kind of basic things like he's a blessed son of his father, but so was Jesus, right? What else could we say?
They both had half brothers that wasn't always supportive of them.
Okay, good. I hadn't thought about that one. That's good. Ross?
Joseph ended up saving the lives of a lot of people physically.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus has saved the lives of millions spiritually.
Amen. Bill?
Certainly from this point forward with Joseph, he and Jesus were both faithful and obedient when it was not convenient to be so.
Good.
The prayer I would take from Joseph moving forward is, may I be as faithful in another man's house as he was.
Yeah.
Whether it's, my boss, it doesn't matter what it is, but he was faithful when he didn't really benefit so much from it. It was more his boss's stuff, but he was faithful in another man's house.
Mm-hmm. Good. Good observation. Pam?
They were both treated unjustly through no fault of their own.
Very true. They both were tempted and did not give in to temptation. What else? Any other thoughts? Ross?
They both suffered
They both suffered immensely,
a lot.
didn't they? They both were sold out for pieces of silver. Joseph for 20 and Jesus for 30. Interesting thing to think about. We already talked about the wrongly accused. Carla?
They were both forgiving.
They're both forgiven?
Forgiving.
Forgiving. Good. Thank you. Thank you. Very forgiving. Took them a while maybe, but not too long. Marcy?
That point, what Joseph says at the end, you meant it for bad, but God meant it for good, for evil. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And the Israelites crucified Christ, his brothers selling him out, just the betrayal and everything. But it was for our good. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's so good just to see how God can use a tremendously dysfunctional situation and bring good out of it. And, really long term, provide for the salvation of the world. So thanks for all your comments and participation tonight. If you do have children downstairs, make sure and pick those kiddos up right away. And I do apologize if it's a little bit cool in here. We're having a little bit of an issue with the furnace. So we'll hopefully have that resolved by Sunday. Thanks again.